Marcus Wellington had built an empire on other people's broken dreams. For 30 years, he sat behind a mahogany desk in the largest bank in Cedar Falls, signing foreclosure notices with the same cold efficiency that most people use to sign birthday cards. He never looked at the faces in the photographs that sometimes fell out of the loan files. He never read the handwritten pleas stapled to payment requests. To Marcus, these weren't families losing their homes. They were simply numbers that didn't add up, risks that hadn't paid off, investments gone bad, and in the world of high finance there was no room for sentiment. There was only profit and loss, and Marcus had made certain he always landed on the winning side. The winter of 2004 had been particularly brutal for Cedar Falls. The factory that employed half the town had closed without warning, leaving families scrambling to make mortgage payments with unemployment checks that barely covered groceries. Marcus saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. He rejected payment extensions, denied refinancing applications, and accelerated foreclosure proceedings. By spring, 17 families had lost their homes, their possessions piled on frosted lawns while children watched from car windows, trying to understand why they couldn't go back inside. Marcus bought 12 of those properties at auction for a fraction of their worth, then sold them 2 years later when the market recovered, multiplying his wealth while those same families were still living in cramped apartments or doubled up with relatives who could barely afford to take them in. If you believe in second chances, in the power of justice, and in standing up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, please hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring more stories that matter to light. Among those 17 families was the Martinez household. Carmen Martinez had worked double shifts as a nurse while her husband Roberto patched together hours at 3 different part-time jobs after the factory closure. They had 2 children, Sofia, who was 8, and little Miguel, who was only 5. The Martinezes had never missed a payment before the factory closed. They came to the bank 6 times, bringing documentation of their job searches, proof of Carmen's increased hours, a plan to catch up within 6 months. Marcus reviewed their file for exactly 4 minutes before stamping it denied. The math didn't work in his favor. The property value was climbing, and he knew he could flip it quickly. 8 weeks later, the Martinezes were evicted on a Tuesday morning while both parents were at work. Their children pulled from school by a social worker because there was nowhere else for them to go. Miguel Martinez never forgot watching his mother collapse on the courthouse steps that day, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. He never forgot his father's face, aged 10 years and 10 minutes, as he loaded their remaining belongings into a borrowed truck. He never forgot his sister holding his hand in the shelter that night, promising him it would be okay even though her voice shook with fear. And he never forgot the name Marcus Wellington, spoken like a curse by every family in the shelter, by every parent who couldn't explain to their children why they had to leave their rooms, their pets, their schools, their entire lives behind. The Martinez family scattered after that. Roberto's spirit broke along with his bank account, and he left one morning and never came back. Carmen worked herself into early graves, dying of a heart attack at 53. Her body simply giving up after 2 decades of exhaustion and stress. Sofia managed to finish high school while working full-time, but the dreams she'd once had of becoming a teacher evaporated under the weight of survival. She moved to another state wanting to forget Cedar Falls entirely. But Miguel held on to something different. He held on to anger, yes, but also determination. He watched his family disintegrate because one man decided their suffering was an acceptable cost for his profit. And he made a promise to the memory of his mother. Someday, things would be different. Miguel worked 3 jobs through high school, slept 4 hours a night, and graduated valedictorian. He went to college on scholarships and student loans, majoring in finance and law. While other students went to parties, Miguel studied. While they slept in on weekends, he worked. Every case study about banking ethics, every lecture about fiduciary responsibility, every discussion about the 2008 housing crisis. He absorbed it all with the focus of someone who had lived the consequences. He graduated top of his class from law school, then spent 5 years working for a non-profit legal organization that specialized in predatory lending cases. He won 43 cases in those 5 years, helping families keep their homes, holding banks accountable, learning every loophole and every law that men like Marcus Wellington used to justify their cruelty. And then, in 2024, Miguel came home to Cedar Falls, not for nostalgia, not for closure, but because he had spent 2 years building an airtight case, and he was finally ready to bring it to trial. Marcus Wellington was 71 now, still wealthy, still comfortable, still sitting in his renovated home office in the largest house in Cedar Falls. He had long since retired from the bank, but his investments continued to grow. He had never apologized, never looked back, never lost a single night of sleep over the lives he had destroyed. Why would he? He had broken no laws. He had simply been good at his job. When the summons arrived, delivered by a professional process server, Marcus barely glanced at it before handing it to his attorney. Another nuisance lawsuit from someone who didn't understand how business worked. His lawyer would make it disappear like all the others, but this lawsuit didn't disappear. Miguel had spent years collecting evidence, interviewing families, gathering documents that banks were required by law to keep, but hoped no one would ever request. He had proof that Marcus had systematically targeted vulnerable families during the 2004 crisis, that he had rejected legitimate hardship applications without proper review, that he had violated fair lending practices and fiduciary duties repeatedly. More importantly, Miguel had found 12 other families willing to join the case, their stories forming a pattern of deliberate exploitation that could no longer be dismissed as simple business decisions. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Marcus sat in the defendant's chair, his expensive suit and confident demeanor slowly crumbling as witness after witness took the stand. A woman described watching her teenage son attempt suicide after they lost their home. A man explained how his marriage didn't survive the shame of foreclosure. A grandmother testified about choosing between medication and rent after being displaced. And then Miguel took the stand, not as the attorney, but as a witness. He looked directly at Marcus Wellington and calmly, without raising his voice, described in detail what happens to a 5-year-old child when his entire world collapses. He described the shelter, the hunger, the fear, the sound of his mother crying through thin walls, the empty space at the dinner table where his father used to sit. When people talk about justice, they often imagine dramatic moments of revenge or punishment, but real justice is quieter and more profound. The jury found in favor of the plaintiffs. Marcus Wellington was ordered to pay $8.7 million in damages, his reputation destroyed, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about greed and consequences. But more than that, the case established legal precedent that would make it harder for other bankers to exploit vulnerable families the same way. The settlement money was distributed among the 13 families, amounts that couldn't restore what they'd lost but could finally provide stability, could help grandchildren go to college, could let aging survivors retire with dignity. After the verdict, Miguel stood on those same courthouse steps where his mother had once collapsed, now surrounded by the families he had fought for. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt tired and sad and grateful that his mother's suffering had not been meaningless. Sophia came back to Cedar Falls for the first time in 15 years to stand beside her little brother, crying tears that were equal parts grief and pride. The children of the other affected families, now adults themselves, many with children of their own, gathered to thank the young lawyer who had refused to forget them. Marcus Wellington left the courthouse through a side door, no longer the powerful figure who had once controlled so many lives with the stroke of a pen. He was just an old man who had finally learned that every decision has a human cost, and eventually that cost comes due. Miguel returned to his nonprofit work, using his portion of the settlement to fund a foundation that provided free legal services to families facing foreclosure. He never tried to contact Marcus Wellington again. Revenge had never been the point. The point was ensuring that the next child who watched their family lose everything might have someone to fight for them, might have a chance his family never got, might grow up in a world slightly more just than the one that had broken his mother's heart. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is remember the injustice. Remember the faces. Remember that behind every number in a file is a family, a life, a child who will carry those memories forever. And then when the time comes, use that memory not to destroy, but to build something better. If this story moved you, if you believe in accountability and the long arc of justice, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us why compassion and courage matter. Your engagement helps these important stories reach the people who need them most.